So far, we've discussed mostly two-dimensional media and processes, but sculpture exists in 3D. It occupies physical space and invites interactions with the viewer. Now, there are three basic ways that we experience sculpture: relief, sculpture in the round, and sculpture as an environment. We've already talked some about relief and sculpture in the round while we were discussing form in week one, but we'll get into these a bit more specifically in this section. So remember, relief sculpture is not freestanding. It's engaged or attached. It projects from a background surface, and it has a definite viewpoint in mind. We're looking at a low relief panel made of alabaster that was found inside the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II in his palace in Nineveh. This dates to about 875 to 860 BCE. Most of these alabaster relief panels in this palace are narratives. They depict the king and his subjects, excuse me, and they show, like this one, hunting scenes. So here the king is in a chariot, which is being pulled by horses. He draws his bow at an attacking lion, while another lion is dying or maybe being trampled under the horses here. This is probably depicting a ceremonial hunt, and it was intended to show the power of the king who hunted and killed the most fearsome beasts in Assyria. Now, as I said, there are hundreds of these showing Assyrian kings kind of defeating lions in battle or in hunts, really sort of a symbol of kingly power. But in reality, these hunts often involved lions being put in cages for the king to kill, so not quite as impressive when you think of it that way. This is another alabaster relief from the king's palace. This simply shows a dying lioness. We have arrows stabbing the lion and blood pouring from the wounds. Obviously, she's in great pain, kind of pulling herself forward, snarling in pain and anger, I would say. Now, this is low relief or bas relief. The sculptor's marks are shallow. There's not a lot of depth, really just enough to communicate the scene here. So here's another, this one showing scenes of everyday life within the palace. Here we have the king reclining on a central couch. He's sort of higher than the others, while the queen sits next to him in a chair. They both lift cups to their mouths to drink. There are musicians and servants with food and fans. You can see the king has taken off his royal necklace and hung it sort of off the back of his couch here. He has laid his weapons over on this table. So this is a sort of relaxed moment, kind of a simple, maybe slightly celebratory, but nothing too grand. But if you look closely, you might notice off to the side here, we actually have the enemy's head hanging from this tree. So this is likely a celebration of the king's defeat of an enemy here. So a bit gruesome in the details, but tells us about the context of the scene, right? But again, this is all done in low relief. There's not much variation in the depth of carving. All of the imagery is sort of on the same shallow level, and instead the artist has used techniques such as the overlapping of forms or the variation of scale to suggest depth within this scene. Now here we have Susan Durant's Memorial to King Leopold from 1867, and here the artist has used various levels of relief. So high relief is when an image protrudes further. So in this composition, the lion and Leopold himself are done in higher relief, which creates a greater sense of depth, whereas the angels in the background are done in lower relief. They don't protrude as much from the surface. And we could take that even farther. The angels' faces are done in higher relief than their wings, sort of indicating that the figures are leaning forward in the space. Their heads and upper bodies are closer to the viewer than their wings are. Now, Leopold was the first king of Belgium after they declared their independence from the Netherlands. So he was highly praised for that, but he was also not the greatest guy. The lion here probably refers to his sort of relentless occupation of the African Congo during the time. Um, very, very big proponent of colonization, King Leopold. So we have sort of these contrasting ideas about one man in one composition, perhaps, and then again depicted in different uh, levels of relief. It's sort of interesting to look at these two together, or you could go back and look at the image of the Assyrian king in the chariot hunting the lions in comparison to Leopold here. Both of these reliefs were made for kings. Both used the lion to sort of showcase the power and dominance of the king, one through hunting and one through colonial submission. One is in strictly low relief, whereas the other uses a combination, though perhaps mostly high relief. Um, so consider these together. Is one more expressive or more successful than the other? Is low relief less expressive than high relief? What do you think? Give that some thought. So in our discussion of form, we talked about sculpture in the round as sculpture that was meant to be viewed from all sides. We also can call this freestanding sculpture, but sometimes freestanding sculpture is made with a fixed viewpoint in mind. For example, here we have an Egyptian sculpture of the Lady Senui. This comes from about 1971 to 1926 BCE. Senui was the wife of a powerful governor of an Egyptian province. This sculpture was made so that her back would sit against a wall or a pillar. So it was meant to be viewed mostly from the front, which is quite common in Egyptian sculpture here. Now, this is carved out of granite, and you can sort of get a sense of that original granite block. In the final sculpture, we get this straight, upright position, these rigid kind of posture. Her arms and legs are held tight to the body. Really, the sculpture itself still takes on a very blocky kind of shape. And granite is also very hard stone, so it's difficult to carve. So it sort of makes sense as to why this sculpture would retain those certain qualities here. Now, keep in mind, Egyptian artists didn't leave their figures attached like this because of a lack of skill. Rather, it was a conscious choice. They believed in consistency and stability. They thought these were the most desirable traits of a good Egyptian citizen and ruler. So the semi-attached sort of blockiness of this sculpture really reflects that. It represents a woman who carried on the traditional beliefs of ancient Egypt, and it's very much a symbol of power, of cultural identity, and of cultural belief. In contrast, we have Giambellini's Rape of the Sabine Women, meaning the abduction of the Sabine women. This work really utilizes the in the roundness or the three-dimensionality of freestanding sculpture. The viewer cannot see all of the expressions or all of the aspects of the composition from any fixed viewpoint. Instead, they have to move around, interact with the sculpture and the space that it occupies in order to get the full experience. So Giambellini was a Flemish artist who worked in Florence during the 16th century. He was commissioned by the Florentine ruler Francesco de' Medici to create this work. And this is carved from a single piece of marble. This work tells the ancient story about the founding of Rome, which occurred around 753 BCE. According to the story, Romulus, the original founder of Rome, and his mostly male followers found the city, but in order to grow, they realized they need wives. However, none of the local women were really interested in becoming the wives of these men because they knew it would increase their power and just give them more to be in control of. So, to remedy this, During the festival of Neptune, the Roman men snuck over to their neighboring city of Sabine and kidnapped the Sabine women, forcing them to marry them and thus creating the first generation of Roman men. So Giambolini here is attempting to capture an entire narrative within a single sculpture, as well as show off his sculptural skills. And this also serves as a nice figure study. But we have a Roman man sort of crouching near the bottom here a Sabine man crouching at the bottom here as the Roman man sort of charges over him to abduct the Sabine woman. The man crouching is rather horrified, as is the woman being taken. But the figures come together to create this sort of tightly bound, almost twisting, spiraling column of energy that moves upwards and around and encourages that viewer to also move around in order to view the many different aspects of the work. The figures are composed of really sort of sinuous lines and kind of graceful curves that really help to communicate these exaggerated poses and the emotions of this scene. There are lots of diagonal lines that imply energy and motion and create this somewhat precarious feeling, as if perhaps this sculpture could topple over at any moment, but really it's quite well balanced. It's very engaging, quite dramatic and beautiful. Now, Giambolini intended this as political propaganda, not just an illustration of an ancient story. This was meant to symbolize the ability of a small community to grow into one of the most powerful cities in Italy. So Giambolini here is announcing that Florence, though once a small community, had now become a force to be reckoned with, and it really didn't paint Rome, which was Florence's rival at the time, in a very pretty light. So typically, sculpture is either a subtractive process or an additive process. And we'll talk about subtractive sculpture first. So subtractive sculpture begins with a mass of material larger than the finished work, and the sculpture removes or subtracts material from that mass until the work's final form is achieved. So carving is one of the most ancient techniques of subtractive sculpture. With carving, an artist uses a tool to chip, cut, gouge, saw, or hammer away the unwanted material. Now, before beginning, the carver would visualize the finished form and usually mark out the form on that material. Most ancient works of sculpture that still exist were made with subtractive methods. For example, we saw this stele of the sculptor Usurur from the 12th dynasty Egypt, in which the relief has been sort of carved out, right? Here's another example, an even more ancient example. This comes from about 12,000 BCE during the Paleolithic period. This is carved out of reindeer horn. It's about 4 inches long. Technically, it is a three-dimensional sculpture, but really the image has been carved in 2D, kind of in low relief, fit within the limited space of this piece of horn. So we have this carved profile head of a bison turning to lick its back. Sometimes this carving is titled Bison Licking an Insect Bite, though we're not exactly sure, what the bison is meant to be doing. But we have hatch lines that depict the details of the hair, the nostrils, etc. So bisons often represent virility, food, as well as the struggle between humanity and animalistic nature. They were very important to early peoples as a source of food, of hides, etc. This piece might have been a power object, thought to give the owner some of the abilities of the animal, or maybe control over the animal, and it was likely carried around daily, possibly as part of a spear thrower, or maybe just a small kind of object to hold and contemplate. Now, subtractive sculpture in the round is a bit more challenging to create than a two-dimensional relief or two-dimensional subtractive sculpture. And really, there's a whole process that takes place before the carving actually starts. An artist doesn't just dive into a block of marble or granite without having a plan, because this is what happens. Materials are expensive and unforgiving. Marble or granite can break, and once you've taken off a piece, you can't put it back. So, unlike Squidward, like SpongeBob, the artist should first visualize their concept and concentrate. They embrace the marble. They sniff the marble. They become the marble. And ta-da! Here we are. But most people aren't SpongeBob in this case. Rather, most people are Squidward. So most artists would practice with softer materials like plaster or clay before actually moving on to their final marble or granite block. They would get a complete idea of the form they're working on first and then begin. For example, Giambolini created a plaster version of his Rape of the Sabine Women before he began working on his marble block. So again, the artist should visualize the finished form from every angle and mark out the material accordingly. And then working from the outside in, they carefully remove any pieces and pay attention to all of the angles as they work. Because again, these are unforgiving materials and you cannot put back any of the material that you have taken off once it's taken off. Michelangelo stands out within the history of art for his unique mastery of sculptural methods and materials. He worked in a subtractive method, but sort of unconventionally. Michelangelo envisioned his carving process as releasing the figure from within the block of stone, as if they were already trapped inside, and he simply had to remove or subtract the excess material to free them. Now, most sculptors remove progressively from all sides, kind of turning around the block of stone or whatever their material is as they work. But Michelangelo began on one side and carved all the way through to the other side. We're looking at an example. This is titled Awakening Slave, sometimes called The Prisoner, from 1519 to 1520. This is one of 4 unfinished or non finito sculptures of prisoners for the mausoleum of Pope Julius II. You can sort of see the chisel marks around the figure as it barely emerges from this block of stone. It appears to be struggling against it. We have this powerful musculature of the body kind of twisting in effort, kind of under the weight of this material that refuses to give it up. It's holding the figure enslaved. And yes, this work is unfinished, but it doesn't really matter. It is impressive enough that it stands well as a finished work on its own. There's this really nice contrast between the textures of the chiseled stone and the smooth figure, and these really serve to enhance the play of light over the surface and kind of play up those shadows and highlights and things, really creating a naturalistic or realistic sense of figure here. Now, here is another sculpture that Michelangelo created for the tomb of Pope Julius II between 1513 and 1516. However, because he was commissioned to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he was pulled away from this tomb project, and it was scaled way back. And then he actually died before he got to return for the project, so it was never completed the way that he envisioned it. But we do have some aspects of his vision that still survive today, including this sculpture of Moses. So this was meant for a niche. As you can see here, it has its back sort of situated against the wall. However, it was, or rather it seems to have been really released completely from the stone. There's no excess material left behind. It's not engaged or attached or confined to the stone block, really. Michelangelo has used pretty high relief all the way around the form. He's created this large, rather imposing figure. It's nearly 8 feet tall, or yeah, it's about 7 foot 8.5 inches. If the figure were to stand, he wouldn't fit in the niche that he's in. So he's quite oversized here. Moses is depicted quite muscly, and he seems rather angry or intense, almost as if there's a pent-up energy. It sort of has a sense of movement to it without really becoming overwhelming. You can see one leg is sort of pulled back. Let me turn on my pointer. One leg sort of pulled back here as if he's about to push himself upwards into a standing position. And his torso seems to be sort of extending, stretching as if he's pulling himself upwards. Here under one arm he holds the Ten Commandments, and he sort of gazes off into the distance here, again with quite an intense, almost angry expression. Now you might notice there are horns on his head, which is a little interesting. The Hebrew word keren, Keren, is the word for horn, but also the word for ray of light. And so for a long time and throughout the Renaissance, it was a common mistranslation that Moses descended the mountain, the Mount Sinai, with the Ten Commandments, with rays of radiant light shining upon his face. Often that was translated as he descended the mountain with horns. We don't really know, I suppose, what the true translation would be, but that is why he's depicted here with horns, because in Michelangelo's time, that was the accepted translation of the Hebrew text. Stone is certainly one of the most common carving materials, and different types of stone have different characteristics. And so if we look at these two sculptures together, Michelangelo's Moses and this ancient Egyptian sculpture of the Lady Senue, we can sort of see how each of these forms has really been defined by the materials they're made of. So granite is quite hard and dense, whereas marble is soft and more crystalline. This means that granite is much harder to deal with, and harder to sort of get fine details in than marble, but granite holds up better. It can withstand the test of time, really. Marble is hard, but it's more porous than granite, which means that it can be affected by the elements, things like rain or pollution, and it's more breakable in general. Now, other types of stone that are commonly used for carving or sculpture include sandstone, which is gritty and kind of coarse, but softer than marble and granite, although that also means it's not as durable. We also have limestone, which we discussed a little bit with printmaking, but it's quite soft and it carves rather easily without fracturing, which allows for the creation of elegant curves and crisp lines. Really, the types of stone that can be used for sculpture are endless. You can have alabaster, soapstone, basalt, volcanic rock, on and on and on. But the properties of that stone need to be considered when you're beginning a sculpture. Now, wood is the other most common carving material, but because wood is an organic material, it decays, right? So we don't have as many surviving examples of ancient sculptures made of wood. It sort of depends on the environment that the sculpture was made. Certain conditions preserve wood better than other conditions. For example, in the jungles of Africa or South America, where things are wet and moist a lot, something made out of wood would decay much quicker than it would in the dry, arid landscape of the Peruvian high desert, right? So it's sort of about context and location as well as material. But when using wood for carving or for sculpture, you really need to pay attention to the grain of the wood, or the way in which the wood has grown. To work against the grain risks breaking or cracking, but if you carve with the grain, it creates a smoothly carved line, though those lines are still a bit visible. So here we're looking at a horse and rider sculpture. This is from the Dogon people in Mali, Africa, and it was created in about 1883. So you can see the horse's body is much larger. Um, the body is larger than the head, the head is rather short, kind of downturned. And that's really because of the shape of the wood and the grain of the wood. So the artist has paid attention. You can see these kind of vertical lines that run through the piece. That's the grain of the wood, the direction in which it grew naturally. So the carver has moved sort of along those lines instead of against them in order to shape the head in a way without breaking it off. Ivory is another material that is nice to carve with. We saw a reindeer horn from prehistory earlier. Ivory has been used since ancient times. It's valued for its rarity, its durability, the creamy color, smooth texture, and soft sheen that it emits. Now, it's important to note that the historical use of ivory in Africa was limited. In general, it was reserved for individuals of high status, and it did not put elephant populations at risk. Elephants were seen as powerful and dangerous, and owning ivory was considered a status marker. So before the widespread use of guns and electric carving tools, elephant hunting and ivory carving were specialized occupations. The West African Ivory Coast, which is now an independent country, but the name comes from the trade of ivory elephant tusks, and it was called so by the early European colonists. Now, the advent of colonization really created the global ivory trade between about the 15th and 19th centuries, and this had devastating effects on the African elephant population, which was the main source of ivory. In 1831, the demand for ivory in Britain alone led to the deaths of an estimated 4,000 elephants. During the 1980s, roughly 70,000 African elephants a year were killed for their tusks. And it wasn't until 1990 that the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species declared ivory carving illegal in most circumstances around the globe. The example that we're looking at here is a lidded bowl on a pedestal made for storing salt. It's called a salt cellar. And this comes from Sierra Leone in Africa. So around the base of this cellar, we have attendants that are carved in sort of low relief. Also, we have dogs that bare their teeth at these snakes that dangle down from the midsection of the cellar. This was made by an African carver, likely for a European collector. So we have sort of this mix of African and European forms. I'll post a link on Blackboard about the use of ivory and kind of the conservation of ivory within the art making world, if you would like to check that out a bit more. Here is an example of subtractive architecture. So we're looking at Beta Gorges in Lalibela, Ethiopia of East Africa. So Lalibela was the name of a Zagwe king and saint who ruled in the 12th century. Because of him, that is also the name of this town and the site in northern Ethiopia where there are 11 monolithic rock-cut churches. These are cut out of volcanic tufa or tuf, which is an initially very soft rock, but it hardens when it's exposed to oxygen. So again, this is subtractive architecture, which works in the same way as subtractive sculpture. They've cut away the unwanted material, so any negative space that you see here, which would include the negative space on the interior of the building, which is occupied by people, all of that would have been carved or hollowed out, kind of forming the doors, the windows, the columns, the roof, etc. it looks to be built up in sort of an additive process, but it's not. It was very carefully planned, working top to bottom, and then on the inside of the building from bottom to top, removing all of that excess, um, and creating that empty or negative space. Here's another angle so you can really see how um, the carvers sort of cut or gouged into the side of this hill here, creating the negative space around the exterior of the church building. And then, as I mentioned before, they would have sort of started from the bottom on the interior and carved their way up inside. You can also sort of see in this photo how the roof of the church is mimicking or echoing the kind of slope of the natural hillscape here. So um, now, the opposite of subtractive sculptural methods are additive sculptural methods. In this case, the sculpture builds their work by adding materials together to create the final form. Additive processes of sculpture include modeling, casting, construction, and assemblage. But we'll start with modeling here. So modeling is when a pliable material such as clay, wax, or plaster is built up and pushed into a final form, which we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to 2.6 with craft. We'll talk about ceramics, but this is a good example as well, and sort of related to ceramics because this is made of terracotta. This is the Etruscan sarcophagus from Cerveteri from about 520 BCE. So a sarcophagus is a kind of coffin, right? And this one in particular would have contained the ashes of the deceased. This one was built from 4 separate terracotta pieces that would have been fired in a kiln individually, which again, we'll talk more about firing and kilns and ceramic processes when we get to 2.6. But the Etruscan civilization flourished in central Italy from about the 8th to the 1st century BCE. So here, the sculptor's interpretation of these figures really speaks specifically about Etruscan culture. We have this couple that reclines on a couch, perhaps at a feast, and the sculptor has really paid special attention to the figures, excuse me, to the gestures of the figures. Both seem to be relaxed and happy, enjoying themselves. Their smooth, lifelike upper bodies are vertical and squared. They have wide almond eyes, a soft, warm smile, and rope-like hair. These are rather reminiscent of Greek sculptures, which the Etruscans and the Greeks existed in the same area around the same period of time, so influence and overlap is to be expected. The artist definitely pays less attention to the lower half of the body. Really, the lower halves of the figures seem to sort of sink or blend into the couch that they sit on. It's also interesting that this work depicts the female figure as actively participating within the social situation. They're very close in position, which indicates kind of this intimate bond within their relationship. Maybe the husband's arm around his wife kind of affectionately here. The man, you can see he once held something in his hand here, maybe a drinking glass, and then he seems to be perhaps toasting the viewer as they approach. There are other theories that suggest perhaps it was not a glass that he was holding, but an egg as a symbol of rebirth and fertility, and then his left hand is out flat, kind of open in front of his wife, and she seems to have been holding an object before as well, probably a little vessel that she was pouring oil from in a very common funerary ritual that involves anointing the deceased with perfumed oils. And then it's thought that she also held a pomegranate in her other hand, which was a symbol of immortality. So the fact that the woman is quite involved in the events is interesting and unique. That's not the case in a lot of ancient sculptures, or ancient civilizations. But it's also interesting because we have these projecting elements, the arms and the hands, and that's sort of uncommon with terracotta because clay, specifically wet clay, it cannot support its own weight very well, so it collapses pretty easily if it's protruding in space. So it's likely that the artist has used an armature or sort of a skeletal structural support that would burn away so long as it was made of organic materials in the kiln. And then the fired clay is much lighter, better balanced, things like that. So it's a bit more durable. You don't have to worry about cracking or breaking or toppling as much as you do when it's wet. Again, we'll get into that a bit more when we talk about ceramics later. Now, this sculpture was part of a tomb. Again, it suggests kind of a funerary feast and kind of gives us some insight to Etruscan culture, implying that they held celebrations to honor the death of their loved ones. Maybe the couple is deceased, maybe they're both dead, and this is them enjoying their eternal happiness together, attending their own funerary celebration. Maybe the man is deceased and the woman is depicted performing that anointing ritual. We're not quite sure, but it's an interesting look into an ancient culture. So your book also classes casting as an additive sculptural process, though there is somewhat of a subtractive element to it as well. Casting involves adding a liquid or pliable material to a mold in the shape of a desired form. So here we're looking at a Ryachi warrior from about 460 to 450 BCE. This was discovered along with another, so two in total, by some divers off the coast of Ryachi, Italy in 1972. Both of these figures were complete except for their accessories. They were missing swords, shields, and one helmet. The figures are about 6'2", so pretty life-size. The beard sort of indicates an older individual, but the body and the skin are quite youthful, highly idealized. He's very he's very muscled. His skin is smooth, without imperfections, etc. And there's also an incredibly high level of naturalistic detail here. In the hair, the beard, we have these tight curls. We also can see the veins on the back of his hands and the various textures across the surface of his skin. This particular warrior retains the inlaid eyes, the copper lips, eyelashes, and brows, as well as the inlaid silver of the nipples and the teeth. This figure is in a rather naturalistic pose. It's self-standing, which means that it can stand by itself. It doesn't require the support of a wall or a post or anything like that. And it's in a very naturalistic contrapposto stance, which we'll talk more about contrapposto later, but essentially the weight of the body is placed on one leg, and the other leg, the knee, is bent slightly, which is a pretty relaxed kind of natural position that a standing figure would take. So this is a bronze cast sculpture. Bronze is an alloy of tin and copper, and the ancient Greeks used cast bronze for a lot of sculptures. It was very durable, and when hollow, it's much lighter than stone. And really, it was favored because it allowed for much more dynamic poses and a greater level of naturalism without the risk of breakage that marble or stone had. However, because bronze was so useful, it was often melted and reused. So many of these bronze works from ancient Greece have been destroyed and used in other projects. But let's talk about the process of casting. So there are a few different processes of casting, but we're going to talk about lost wax casting. Now, this is used in part because metal is both expensive and heavy, and casting allows the artist to execute a work in a more easily handled medium, like wax, and then reproduce the results in a more permanent material, like bronze. This is quite an old process. It was developed in China, Greece, Rome, parts of Africa, in ancient times. Essentially, the artist builds up a clay core around an armature. Then they add a thick layer of wax over the clay and carve in details. They build wax rods and cups to create sort of an arterial system around the form, and then they drive metal pins through the wax into the clay core. The whole thing is encased in a specially prepared clay mixture that hardens and preserves the details that have been carved into the wax. The artist drills holes into the bottom and fires the whole thing in a kiln, so the wax melts and runs out the bottom, leaving a hollow space inside. Then, molten metal can be poured into this mold, and when it cools and hardens, the mold is broken to reveal the work. So that is a downside to this process. The mold must be broken in order to reveal the final work. So each time a new mold would have to be made. But anyway, after breaking the mold, the artist would cut off the excess metal rods and pins, sand and polish the surface, etc. And then generally the clay core would be sort of broken up from the holes in the bottom and removed. However, the Riachi warriors still had those clay cores inside them upon their discovery. Those clay cores had been absorbing lime and sea salt for thousands of years, and really had furthered the effects of the erosion on the sculpture. But after their discovery, the cores were removed and the sculptures were sort of cleaned and restored a bit. And again, they were still quite well preserved. And the fact that they were found in the sea indicates that they were probably placed on a ship, being sent to maybe someone who had commissioned them or somewhere to sell. And actually, they were probably saved by the shipwreck. If they had arrived at their destination, they would have likely been melted down at some point and reused for something else. So they might not exist if they had not been a part of this shipwreck. Now, again, there are other types of casting processes that don't require the breaking of the mold, so you can create a lot of copies of one work, but for the sake of this class, we're going to leave it at lost wax casting. Now, your book also puts ready-mades, assemblage, earthworks, and a couple others in this chapter with sculpture, and they are sculpture, but they're just non-traditional sculptural medias and processes. So I'm going to address those more in our later section about alternative medias and processes, and our history and kind of themes section. But check the part of the chapter out that discusses these as well.